Welcome back to our Object Relations Concept Lecture Series. It's delightful to be here today, and I want to share with you a very important topic related to psychic regret. You know, we use the term regret very colloquially and commonly, but so many times people aren't aware of what regret is as a feeling level phenomena and a conscious, deep sense of existential grief that goes with feeling sorry for what one has done. Now, my views on this go back to Melanie Klein, who wrote about loss and guilt in the depressive position, which is the higher level of psychic development in her theories. And she spoke about hurting the one you love. And this is very important related to my own thinking about psychic regret. But I also see regret in terms of regret about what one might do to oneself, to sabotage oneself as well as to hurt another. That one, or hurt the relationship in terms of avoiding or being hostily destructive towards the relatedness and communication in the relationship, or sustaining the connection in the relationship. So I've been studying this for a while, and what I mean by psychic regret is a more full experience than we normally talk about as regret. It definitely is not something just cognitive. It's very much at a feeling level where we feel the deepest sense of loss and grief because we have lost something in making some mistake that harms our relationships or harms our internal world relationships, where we sabotage ourselves. So the very important factor is that we have to be conscious of our regrets in order to move forward developmentally. And I found in clinical work that when someone really is willing to go from an unconscious level of regret, where we defend many ways, many defenses against being aware of our regrets. We hate to admit that we're the ones who were at fault in things. It's a very difficult thing to do, but in treatment you get support, and with an object relations psychotherapist you get support to do this. So facing one's own regret means really experiencing consciously, without denial, awareness of one's own mistakes. And it's not just a cognitive or intellectual experience, it's very much a feeling of grief and loss that we've damaged our relationships or sabotaged ourselves. And my clinical work has particularly shown that people go through very important life changes and move forward in their lives, and their personalities can even change if they're willing to face consciously their regret. So I call that conscious existential feeling grief level psychic regret, as opposed to just a regret that you might have intellectually. And it goes back to Melanie Klein's theories on loss and guilt in the depressive position, but I have the context of my own theory that extends from her depressive position views, called Developmental Mourning, which I've written about in many of my books and articles. And within Developmental Mourning, it's about how psychic development can be motivated through getting to the deepest level on which we have loss and feeling the grief and facing that. But in my current thinking on psychic regret, I also speak about how consciousness of regret and the loss in that is within the developmental mourning process, is a particular way that people can move forward in their development and resolve psychic conflicts in order to grow and develop. So I extend Klein's theory But the concept of psychic regret is within my own theory of developmental mourning, very much inspired by Klein's thinking and all the other object relationists, the British theorists, as well as American object relations theorists. And my developmental mourning theory is very much focused on feelings, or what we call affects, and the developmental sequence of how, when we experience our aggression consciously, and all of which does go back to Klein, that mourning involves conscious facing of aggression. It's not just loss, the way Freud talked about. Excuse me. It's also about aggression and facing all the feelings around loss to get to loss. And regret becomes a very important way that we face ourselves and own our mistakes on a deep feeling level. So we have existential grief as opposed to a defensive kind of guilt, like the kind Ronald Fairbairn talked about, where there's a spurious guilt that protects the image of the parent or the other by blaming the self. This is not regret. True regret, psychic regret, means that you are really owning something that existentially, on a deep heart and soul level as well, not just an intellectual level, was actually something you are responsible for. It's not a defensive guilt where you're trying to protect another person or a parent. It's an actual existential grief that's authentic guilt, as opposed to spurious or defensive guilt. So that kind of consciousness awakens the soul and the heart and the mind all together, and it becomes a very self-integrative experience to move forward in our lives. And I've studied this for some time, and I've actually written a whole book about regret called Anatomy of Regret, which will be coming out with Karnak Press in London this year, 2012. And in this book I have a variety of clinical cases where you can see in each unique individual how the confrontation of conscious regret moved their lives forward and allowed them to have relationships and intimacy and sustain intimacy and love and sustain their connectedness to their own creative work in the world. How this emerges all together once they're willing to face regrets consciously at a feeling level of psychic regret, and not to avoid it and keep it unconscious. Because when regret is kept unconscious, it actually sabotages the self. So there's a very important distinction between being willing to consciously own one's mistakes through consciousness of regret, which has grief feelings in it, feelings of grief and loss, and when one is self-sabotaging by avoiding it and denying it and keeping it unconscious, then we actually repeat mistakes and don't learn from them, and then we're sabotaging ourselves. So there's a critical difference between consciousness of regret, which involves the feeling of grief, and unconscious regret. When it's denied or kept unconscious, we can repeat the same mistakes over and over and sabotage ourselves. And this goes back to Freud, who said when we don't remember, we repeat. But he didn't speak about the actual level of grief and mourning that goes into healing the self and the soul in this way that Melanie Klein began, in which I extend in my theories of developmental mourning and in my particular theory and my book on psychic regret called Anatomy of Regret, coming out with Karnak now.